Alira stood before the mirror, while two maids pinned silver combs into her hair, and she watched her own face like a stranger's. Tomorrow, she would be a queen. Tonight, she would be a bride. And by dawn, according to every rumor whispered in every kitchen and every corridor of this palace, she might not be alive to see the sun rise over her new kingdom. That was what they said about Alpha King Ronan. That his first wife had vanished within a season. That the second had returned to her family, broken and silent, refusing ever to speak his name again. That his own pack feared him more than they revered him, and that the moon itself seemed to darken over his fortress on the nights he chose to feed his temper instead of his mercy. Alira didn't know which parts were true. She only knew that in 3 days her father's kingdom had signed her life away to secure a border, and no one had thought to ask her whether she was willing to pay that price. "Hold still, Your Highness," the elder maid murmured, tucking one final comb into place. There. A vision. A vision of what? Alira thought. A sacrifice dressed in silk. The door opened without a knock, the way it always did when her sister came looking for her, and Wren swept in with her boots still muddy from the stables and her dark hair escaping its braid in a dozen directions. Where their mother's blood had given Alira soft gold hair and a face that photographed well for treaties and portraits, it had given Wren something else entirely, a temper, like flint, a mouth that never learned when to close, and eyes that missed nothing. "You're not eating," Wren said, before the door had even shut behind her. "I'm not hungry. You're never hungry the week before something terrible happens." Wren crossed the room and dismissed the maids with a single look, one that said this conversation was not for other ears. When they had gone, she knelt at Alira's feet the way she used to when they were girls trading secrets under a blanket fort. "Talk to me. There's nothing to say." Alira kept her eyes on the mirror rather than her sister's face. "I marry him tomorrow. I go to his bed tomorrow night. That is the arrangement, and the arrangement was never mine to refuse." "You're shaking." "I'm not." "Alira," Wren said, and her voice dropped the teasing edge it usually carried. "You are shaking, and I have heard the same stories you have, and I am not going to sit here and pretend this is a normal wedding." Alira's hands stilled in her lap. For 3 days she had rehearsed calm. She had practiced the walk, the vows, the polite stillness a queen was meant to wear like a second skin. She had told herself that fear was a luxury she could not afford, not with her father's kingdom depending on this alliance, not with soldiers already stationed along the very border this marriage was meant to secure. But alone with her sister, the calm cracked all at once, like ice giving way beneath a foot that had trusted it too long. "I keep thinking about the second wife," she whispered. "They say she doesn't speak of what happened in that room. Not one word. Not to her family, not to anyone. What kind of man does that to someone?" "I don't know," Wren said, "but I know I'm not going to let you walk into it blind. That isn't a choice either of us gets to make." Wren was quiet for a long moment, and Alira recognized that silence. It was the silence her sister wore right before she said something reckless. "Let me go instead." Alira turned so fast the last comb slipped loose from her hair. "What?" "Just for the ceremony. Just for tonight." Wren's chin lifted, stubborn as ever. "Nobody at that court has seen your face up close. We're near enough in height, near enough in coloring under a veil and candlelight. I go through the vows in your place. I go to his chambers in your place. And if he is even half of what they say he is, I find that out before you ever have to. You cannot be serious. I have never been more serious in my life. This isn't a game," Alira said, her voice rising. "If he discovers the deception, he will have every right to call it treason. He could kill you for it, Wren, and no one, no kingdom, no army would stop him. Then, he won't discover it," Wren said simply, as though that settled the matter. I've spent my whole life being told I'm too loud, too much, too impossible to marry off. Let something I'm too much for finally be useful. Let me protect you the one time it actually costs something. Alira wanted to refuse. She opened her mouth to refuse. But some small, exhausted, terrified part of her, the part that had spent 3 sleepless nights imagining a stranger's hands, a stranger's rage latched onto the offer like a drowning woman latches onto driftwood. And she hated herself a little for it, even as she felt the relief flood through her chest. Just the first night, she said finally. Just to see what kind of man he truly is. And if it's safe, if he's even remotely what a husband should be, you tell me the truth, and I go to him myself after. And if it isn't safe? Alira met her sister's eyes in the mirror. Then we run. Both of us. Before dawn, Ren smiled, the fierce, reckless smile that had gotten them both into trouble since they were children stealing apples from the orchard walls, and reached for the veil laid out across the bed. Then let's get me dressed like a queen, she said. How hard can it be to survive one husband nobody else has managed to? Neither of them said what they were both thinking, that the women who had failed to survive him had likely thought the very same thing. Outside, the palace bells began to ring, calling the court to the chapel, and somewhere beyond the mountains, in a fortress built of black stone and older grudges, Alpha King Ronan was already being dressed for a wedding he had not wanted either. To a bride whose face he had never once been shown, for reasons that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with a secret he had been carrying for 3 long years that made the idea of taking any wife at all feel less like a celebration and more like a countdown. The chapel was full of candlelight and cold air, and Ren walked down the aisle beneath a veil so heavy she could see only shapes, pale stone columns, the blur of noble faces turning to watch her pass, and at the end of it all, a figure so tall and so still he might have been carved from the same black rock as his fortress. She had expected a monster. What she saw was a wall. Alpha King Ronan did not fidget the way nervous grooms did. He did not smile the practiced smile of a man performing kindness for an audience. He simply watched her come toward him with an expression so unreadable that Ren's confidence, usually unshakable, faltered for the first time since she'd made her reckless promise to her sister. Up close, beneath the veil, she could see the scars, one through his eyebrow, one along his jaw, the kind of marks earned in battles that were fought and won, rather than merely survived. His eyes were a pale, unsettling gold, and when they finally settled on her, really settled, something in his jaw tightened. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a puzzle with a missing piece. Ren kept her chin lifted the way Alira always did, kept her hands folded the way a proper princess would, and prayed to every god she'd ever half believed in that a veil and bad lighting would be enough. Do you, Alpha King Ronan of the Blackridge Pack, take this woman as your mate and queen, the priest intoned, to honor, to protect, and to rule beside, until the moon calls you home? I do, Ronan said, and his voice was low and even, the voice of a man who had learned long ago not to let anything show in it. Do you, Princess Alira of Aldenmere, take this man as your mate and king, to honor, to trust, and to stand beside, until the moon calls you home? I do, Ren said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, steady enough that no one in that chapel so much as blinked. Then, rings were exchanged, and a blessing was spoken over joined hands, and Ren felt the brief, startling warmth of Ronan's palm against hers, rough with old calluses, careful in its grip. Nothing like the crushing hand of a brute she had braced herself for. That carefulness unsettled her, more than cruelty would have. The feast afterward was a blur of toasts and formal introductions she navigated with the ease of a woman who had spent years pretending to be exactly where she was supposed to be. She kept the veil in place even through the meal, citing modesty, tradition, anything that came to mind, and no one questioned a nervous bride for wanting privacy on her wedding night. But she caught Ronan watching her more than once across the long table, not with suspicion exactly, not yet, but with the focused attention of a man cataloging details. The way she held her fork. The way she laughed at something his general said. Too loud. Too real. Nothing like the composed laugh of a woman raised for court. The way her eyes tracked the exits of the room instead of the faces in it. He said nothing. He only watched. By the time the court finally released them to the private wing of the fortress, Ren's heart was hammering hard enough that she was certain he could hear it, certain that whatever heightened senses came with being an alpha would betray her before she ever reached his chambers. The corridor to his rooms was long, lined with old tapestries depicting wars Ren didn't recognize, wars that had clearly shaped this man long before any wedding had. "You're quiet," Ronan said, his first words to her since the ceremony, spoken without looking at her, his eyes fixed ahead. "I was told royal brides are meant to be demure," Ren said carefully, borrowing every ounce of Alira's practiced grace. "Were you?" Something in his tone made it not quite a question. They reached a heavy set of doors carved with the same wolf sigil that marked every banner in the fortress, and he pushed them open without ceremony, gesturing for her to enter first. The chambers beyond were spare no excess, no display of wealth for its own sake. Just a large bed, a cold hearth waiting to be lit, and windows thrown open to the mountain air despite the season. A man who didn't need comfort, Ren thought, or didn't believe he deserved it. The doors closed behind them with a soft, final sound, and for the first time since the veil had gone over her face that morning, Ren was entirely alone with the husband she was not supposed to have. He crossed to the hearth and knelt to light it himself, refusing the servant who had followed to do it for him, and Ren used the moment to steady her breathing, to remind herself of the plan, endure the night, learn what she could, report back to Alira by morning, and if anything felt wrong, run before the sun was fully up. "You may remove the veil," he said without turning around. "There's no one left to perform modesty for." Ren's fingers went cold against the fine lace. This was the moment. This was the exact moment her sister had warned her about, the one no plan could survive, and there was no more court, no more crowd, no more candlelight blur to hide behind only firelight, and a king with a soldier's instincts, and a lie about to be tested at the closest possible range. She reached up, slowly, and drew the veil back from her face, and for one long, unbearable heartbeat, neither of them said a single word. "You're not her." The words landed flat and quiet, no anger in them yet, only a terrible certainty, and Ren's stomach dropped straight through the floor. "I don't know what you mean," she said, and even as the lie left her mouth she knew it was useless. Ronan turned from the hearth fully now, firelight catching the gold of his eyes, and for the first time she saw something other than granite stillness in his face. She saw a man doing arithmetic, fitting pieces together, one by one. "The bride I was shown in the betrothal portrait had her sister's coloring," he said. "Same gold hair, same shape of face, but portraits lie about height, about posture, about 100 small things a room full of candlelight can hide. What they can't hide is scent." Ren went very still. "You don't smell like nerves wearing silk for the first time," he said, taking one slow step closer. "You smell like someone who has spent her whole life outdoors. Horses, wood smoke, something underneath it that isn't fear so much as its defiance." "I can explain," Ren said, though she had no idea yet how she would. "Please do," he said, "before I decide whether this was your idea or hers." "It was mine," Ren said quickly. too quickly, stepping between him and a door that led nowhere, as though her body could shield her sister from a threat that wasn't even in the room. Alira didn't want this. Everyone's heard the stories about you, about your first wife, about the second one who won't speak your name. I offered to come in her place, just for tonight, just to see whether any of it was true, before she had to risk herself finding out. Ronan's jaw tightened at the mention of his first two wives, a flicker of something raw crossing his face before the granite slid back into place. "And what have you decided?" he asked, his voice carefully even. "Am I the monster the rumors promised?" "I don't know yet," Ren said honestly. "You haven't given me a reason to think so, but you also haven't given me a reason not to." Something almost like respect moved through his expression. "Most people lie faster and worse than you do," he said. "Most people, when caught, panic. You're still negotiating. I've had practice." "Doing what?" "Being the difficult daughter," she said. "The one who says the wrong thing at the wrong table." I've been managing angry rooms since I was old enough to talk. Ronan studied her for a long moment, and Ren braced herself for guards, for outrage, for the accusation of treason she knew this deception legally carried. Instead, he crossed to the window and looked out at the dark shape of the mountains beyond, his back to her, his shoulders carrying a weight she hadn't noticed until just then. "I should be furious," he said finally. "A princess sends her sister to test me like I'm a wild dog to be muzzled before she'll approach. You're not wrong about the reasoning." "No," he agreed. "I'm not. Because I would have done the same, in her position. Perhaps I already have." "What do you mean?" He didn't answer immediately. When he finally turned back to her, something in his face had shifted, not softened exactly, but opened, the way a door opens onto a room no one has entered in years. "Sit," he said. Not as a command, almost as a request. "There are things you should know before you decide what to tell your sister, and before I decide what to do about a deception that, by every law in this kingdom, I have every right to punish severely." Ren's pulse spiked, but she sat, because running now would confirm every terrible thing anyone had ever said about this fortress, and because some reckless, curious part of her, the part that had gotten her into this in the first place, wanted to hear what he had to say. "My first wife did not vanish because I hurt her," he said quietly. "She left because I asked her to. And my second wife does not refuse to speak my name out of trauma. She refuses because she swore an oath not to. An oath that protected her family from a war neither of us wanted fought. Then, why let the rumors stand? Because the truth is more dangerous than the rumors," he said. "And I would rather be feared as a monster than have anyone come looking for the reason those women really left." Ren opened her mouth to ask the obvious question what reason, but before she could, a low, distant howl rolled through the mountains outside, long and mournful, and Ronan's entire body went rigid, his head turning sharply toward the sound, like a man who had just heard his own execution called from very far away. "That is not one of my pack," he said, low and urgent, all softness gone from his voice in an instant. "That is a warning." A warning of what? He was already moving toward the door, already reaching for a blade set beside it, when he answered her, and the words chilled Ren far more than any rumor about him ever had. "That whoever arranged this marriage of ours did not do it to secure a border," he said. "They did it to lure something out of hiding, and I fear it has just found us both." Meanwhile, 3 valleys away, Alira sat awake in her chambers with a single candle burning low, unable to sleep, unable to stop imagining every possible version of what might be happening to her sister in that fortress. She had told herself she would wait until dawn. She had told herself Ren was capable, clever, harder to frighten than anyone she knew. But the hours crawled by with a slowness that felt deliberate, cruel, and every creak of the old palace made her flinch toward the door. A soft knock finally came, far too soft to be one of the guards, and Alira crossed the room with her heart in her throat, expecting news, expecting anything but what she found. It was her old nurse, old Bet, pale as the moon outside, clutching a folded piece of parchment against her chest like it might burn her. "Your Highness," she whispered, "this came for you by hidden courier. I was told to bring it to no one else." Alira took the parchment with shaking hands, broke the plain wax seal, and unfolded a letter written in a hand she didn't recognize, blunt and hurried, as though written in fear of being caught mid-sentence. "Princess Alira, do not trust the alliance your father has made. The border dispute was manufactured by his own council to force this marriage, because Alpha King Ronan's bloodline carries something the crown of Aldenmere has hunted for 3 generations, a mark that opens the old seal beneath Blackridge Mountain. Your father does not want peace. He wants what sleeps beneath that fortress, and he intends to use his own daughter, or whoever wears her face tonight, as the key to reach it. Trust nothing. Trust no one at that court. Get whoever you love out of that castle before moonrise tomorrow, or there will be no getting them out at all." Alira read it twice, 3 times, her blood running colder with every pass, and looked up at old Bet with a question she was almost afraid to ask. "Who sent this?" "Someone who owed me a debt from long before you were born," Bet said quietly. "Someone who has watched your father's counsel for years and finally decided a warning was worth more than the secret he'd sworn to keep. I don't know more than that, and I'd advise you not to ask." Alira's mind raced back through every strange detail of the past 3 days, the unusual speed with which the marriage contract had been drafted, the insistence from her father's advisors that the wedding happen at Blackridge itself rather than on neutral ground, the way her father had avoided her eyes every time she'd tried to ask why this particular king, why this particular alliance, why now. She had assumed it was simple politics. She had never imagined her own father might be using her, or now, unknowingly, her sister as a tool to unearth something ancient and dangerous from beneath a mountain he had no right to touch. "Ren doesn't know," Alira said, half to herself, already moving toward her wardrobe, already reaching for traveling clothes instead of a nightgown. "She thinks this is a rescue. She has no idea she may have walked herself straight into whatever trap our father built." "Your Highness," Bet said carefully, "if you ride for Blackridge tonight, alone, you will not make it past your father's own border guards. They have orders to keep watch on your movements specifically. I heard it from the stable master myself. Then I won't ride through the front gate," Alira said. "There's an old hunting trail through the eastern pass, the one Ren and I used as children to sneak away from our lessons. It's rough and it's dangerous in the dark, but it isn't watched, because no one but us ever knew it existed. You'd risk that pass at night, alone, for a warning that might already be too late?" Alira paused at the door, one hand on the frame, and thought of every reckless, loyal thing her sister had ever done for her, every time Ren had taken the blame for a broken vase, every time she'd stood between Alira and a cruel tutor's temper, every promise she'd made without hesitation, because that was simply who she was. "She walked into that fortress to protect me," Alira said. "I am not going to sit in a warm bed while she pays for it." She took the letter, tucked it into her bodice against her skin, and slipped out through the servants' passage before Bet could argue further. Her heart pounding not with the fear she'd carried all week about her own wedding night, but with a new and sharper terror, entirely the fear of losing the one person who had never once let her face anything alone. Behind her, the candle guttered out in the draft from the open door, and somewhere far across the dark valley, the same distant howl that had frozen Ronan mid-sentence rolled once more through the mountains, closer now and hungrier. Back in Blackridge, Ronan had a blade in one hand, and Wren's wrist caught gently, but firmly in the other, pulling her away from the window as the howl rolled through the mountains a second time, closer now, layered with something beneath it that didn't sound like any wolf Wren had ever heard. "Stay behind me," he said, and there was no arrogance in it, only the flat efficiency of a man who had done this before and had no intention of losing anyone else tonight. "I'm not the type to hide behind people," Wren said, even as her pulse hammered. "I know," he said, "which is exactly why I need you to do it anyway, just this once." The doors to the chamber shuddered on their hinges, not from a knock but from something testing them, weighing them, the way a wolf tests the strength of a fence before deciding whether it's worth the effort of breaking through. Ronan's eyes flared gold, brighter than before, and Wren realized with a jolt that she was watching him hold his shift back by sheer will alone. "What is it?" she asked. "What's out there?" "Something that shouldn't exist anymore," he said grimly. "Something my grandfather's generation sealed away because it could not be killed, only contained, and contained things do not stay contained forever. Especially not when someone with the right bloodline stands close enough to call to it. The right bloodline. Meaning yours? Meaning whoever wears the crown of Blackridge," he said. "It has always been drawn to us. My father kept it dormant with vigils and wards renewed every season without fail. I let one lapse 3 months ago, distracted by preparations for a wedding I never wanted, and I have felt it stirring ever since like a wound that won't quite close. So this marriage," Wren said slowly, putting pieces together even as fear climbed her throat. "This wasn't only about a border dispute. I don't know what it was about on your father's side," Ronan admitted. "I only agreed to it because my council insisted an alliance would steady my people while I dealt with the wards. I had no idea your father's court even knew what slept beneath this mountain." The door shuddered again, harder, and a crack split down through old wood that had clearly weathered centuries of far worse. "Whatever it wants," Wren said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "We can't just stand here and let it take the door down." "We won't," Ronan said. And for the first time she saw not the granite king from the ceremony, nor the wary interrogator from an hour ago, but something closer to a soldier bracing for a battle he had faced before and survived through sheer refusal to lose. "There's a ward stone beneath this chamber, buried in the foundation stone itself, older than the fortress. It can be resealed, but only by blood freely given, blood that carries the founding line. Yours, mine," he confirmed, "which means you need to be far from this room in the next several minutes, because I have no intention of explaining to your sister why the woman who tried to save her ended up caught in something that was never her fight to begin with. It became my fight the moment I put on that veil," Wren said, refusing to move even as the door groaned under another impact. "Tell me what to do instead of ordering me away from it." Ronan looked at her for one long, searching moment, gold eyes bright in the dim firelight, and something in his expression cracked open the way granite finally gives after enough seasons of rain. "There's a second ward stone in the old chapel crypt," he said finally, low and fast. "If I bleed at this one while someone bleeds at the other simultaneously, the binding doubles, holds twice as long, gives my people time to properly reforge the vigil instead of scraping by on borrowed hours. But it has to be blood given willingly, and it has to happen at exactly the same moment, or the seal splits unevenly and makes the whole thing worse than if we'd done nothing at all." "Then tell me where the crypt is," Wren said, "because I am fairly certain we don't have time to argue about who gets to be reckless tonight." For the first time since the veil had come off her face, something that was almost a smile moved across Ronan's mouth, brief and startled, like a man remembering an emotion he'd filed away as no longer useful to him. "Down the west stair, past the old armory," he said, already moving to unbar a hidden passage behind the tapestry nearest the hearth. "Take this blade. Small cut, palm only, pressed flat to the stone the moment you hear the chapel bell ring 3 times. That will be my signal. And if I'm not fast enough, then be fast enough, he said, pressing the blade hilt first into her hand, his fingers lingering half a second longer than duty required. Because I have buried 2 wives already under circumstances everyone assumes were my doing, and I find, entirely against my own better judgment, that I would very much prefer not to bury a woman who was never even supposed to be mine. The Eastern Pass was worse in the dark than Alira remembered from childhood, when the worst danger had been a skinned knee or a scolding for torn stockings. Now every root felt like a hand reaching for her ankle, and every shadow between the pines looked like it might peel itself away from the trees and follow her. She rode until her borrowed horse was lathered and trembling, then led it the rest of the way on foot when the trail narrowed too much for riding, her father's warning letter pressed against her chest like a second heartbeat. Get whoever you love out of that castle before moonrise. The moon was already climbing. She could see it through gaps in the tree line, fuller and closer than she liked, and she quickened her pace despite her burning lungs, despite the stitch tearing at her side. She heard the howl before she saw the fortress long, distant, wrong in a way she couldn't name, but felt instantly in her bones, an old animal instinct that had nothing to do with court manners or royal composure. It rolled across the valley and did not fade the way a natural howl would. It seemed to linger, layered, as though more than one throat had made the sound at once, or as though whatever made it was very large and very close. Alira had never shifted in her life. Her wolf had always been quiet, unremarkable, the kind that came out for family hunts and nothing more, but for the first time she felt it strain forward beneath her skin, some deep animal part of her recognizing danger long before her mind caught up. She crested the last ridge above Blackridge just as the fortress came into view, black stone against a black sky, and stopped dead at what she saw circling its outer wall. It did not look like a wolf. It did not look like anything that should still be alive. It moved low and wrong, joints bending at angles no living creature should, its shape flickering at the edges like smoke, unwilling to commit to a solid form, and where its eyes should have been there was only a deep, hungry absence that somehow still managed to feel like it was looking directly at her from an impossible distance. Alira pressed herself flat against a boulder, heart slamming, and forced herself to think instead of simply running, because running now, alone, exhausted, would accomplish nothing except getting her killed before she ever reached her sister. There had to be another way in. There always had been, for 2 girls determined enough to escape their tutors, a drainage culvert beneath the eastern wall that led out near the old stables, one the guards had never quite managed to seal despite generations of trying. She moved along the tree line in a wide, careful arc, giving the creature at the main gate as much distance as she could manage, praying it was as fixated on the fortress itself as it appeared to be, praying whatever drew it there hadn't yet noticed one more frightened girl in the dark. The culvert was smaller than she remembered, or she had simply grown since the last time she'd wriggled through it as a reckless child, but she forced herself through the cold, narrow stone, regardless, scraping her palms raw, until she tumbled out into the abandoned lower stables in a heap of torn skirts and ragged breath. Inside the fortress at last, she could hear the alarm bells beginning to ring, distant shouting, the organized chaos of a household realizing it was under siege. She followed the sound of it, moving fast and low through servants' corridors she had no right to know, guided by nothing but instinct and desperation and the certainty, bone deep, that her sister was somewhere at the center of whatever was happening. She found a startled young guard frozen at a junction of corridors, more boy than soldier, clearly unsure whether to run toward the danger or away from it, and grabbed his arm before he could bolt. "The king's chambers," she gasped. "Where are the king's chambers?" He stared at her, confusion and terror warring on his young face. Who are you? No one's meant to be inside the walls tonight. The whole fortress is on lockdown. The beast breached the outer I am the Queen's sister, Alira said, borrowing a title that was, in the strangest possible sense, entirely true tonight. And if you do not tell me where to find her in the next 5 seconds, whatever is happening outside these walls will be the least of what you have to explain to your king by morning. Something in her voice, years of watching her father command rooms, apparently absorbed more deeply than she'd realized, cut through the boy's panic, and he pointed a shaking hand down the corridor toward the west stair. Alira didn't wait to thank him. She was already running, skirts torn, palms bleeding, toward a chapel bell she could hear beginning to toll somewhere deep in the stone beneath her feet. 1. And then a pause. And then a second. The sound of something ancient counting down to a moment she didn't yet understand but felt, with total certainty, that she was not going to reach in time. The crypt beneath the old chapel smelled of stone and centuries, and Wren pressed her palm flat against the cracked surface of a squat gray marker, etched with symbols she couldn't read, waiting for a bell she wasn't certain she'd hear over her own racing pulse. She had left Ronan 2 floors above, blade already drawn, preparing to face whatever circled his walls, while she knelt alone in the dark, trusting an ancient ritual explained to her in less than 2 minutes by a man she'd known for barely a night. It should have terrified her more than it did. Instead, strangely, what she felt was something closer to certainty, the same reckless certainty that had carried her through every impulsive decision of her entire life, the one that had gotten her into this exact situation to begin with. The first bell rang out, low and resonant, shaking dust loose from the crypt's old stones. 2. Wren pressed the small blade to her palm, ready. Above her, in his own chamber, Ronan stood before the twin ward stone set into the hearth's foundation, blade already drawn across his own palm, watching the door buckle inward under a weight that should not have been physically possible for anything with a body. He thought, in the strange suspended clarity that came before violence, of his first wife, who had begged him to let her go before the wards had ever failed, who had somehow known long before he did that this fortress would eventually demand more than either of them could safely give it. He thought of his second wife's oath of silence, the one that had cost her everything but her life. He thought, unexpectedly, and with a force that startled him, of a woman he'd known for less than a full turn of the moon, currently kneeling alone in a crypt, trusting him with the truth about her own mortality. The third bell rang. He pressed his palm flat against the stone, felt the old magic wake beneath his skin like a current finally completing its circuit, and 2 floors below, in perfect unwilled unison, Wren did the same. The effect was immediate and violent. A pulse of golden light rippled out from both stones at once, moving through the fortress's ancient foundations like blood through a vein, and outside the walls, the creature let out a shriek that had no business coming from any living throat. A sound of something being forced backward into a containment it had nearly escaped. The chamber door, which had been seconds from splintering entirely, went suddenly, eerily still. Ronan staggered back from the hearth, breathing hard, watching golden light fade slowly from the stone, and felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't felt in 3 long years. Not safety exactly. Never quite that, but the exhausted relief of a threat delayed rather than merely survived. He was still catching his breath when the door, undamaged now, whole again, burst open from the outside, and he spun with the blade still in hand, every instinct primed for a second wave of danger. Instead, he found a woman he had never met standing in the doorway, chest heaving, palms scraped raw, torn skirts hanging in shreds, staring at him with an expression of pure, desperate relief that made no logical sense at all, until his mind finally caught the resemblance she carried same gold hair as the woman 2 floors below him, same shape to her face, the exact portrait he'd been shown weeks before his wedding. "You're the real one," he said slowly, lowering the blade. "Where's my sister?" Alira demanded, already moving past him to search the room with her eyes, panic barely leashed. "Is she alive?" "Did that thing did it, she's safe," Ronan said, and something in his own voice surprised him with how much he meant it. "She's 2 floors below us, in the crypt, sealing the exact threat you appear to have run through the night to warn us about." Alira's breath caught. "You know. About the seal, about what my father I know now," Ronan said grimly, "though I would very much like to hear how a princess of Aldenmere came to know more about the wards beneath my own fortress than I did 3 hours ago." Before Alira could answer, footsteps sounded on the west stair, quick and light, and Ren appeared in the doorway a moment later, palm bandaged hastily, with a strip of her own torn hem, looking every inch the reckless girl who had marched into a stranger's bed to protect someone she loved and had somehow, impossibly, survived the night to tell the tale. "Alira," Ren breathed, and the 2 sisters collided in the doorway in an embrace fierce enough to nearly knock them both to the floor, years of unspoken fear breaking loose all at once in the safety of finally being wrong about the worst outcome. Behind them, Ronan watched the reunion with an expression he hadn't worn in longer than he cared to admit, and found himself, for the first time since his first wife had walked away from this fortress, for both their sakes, wondering what it might feel like to keep something instead of losing it. They gathered in Ronan's chamber once the sisters had finally loosened their grip on each other, and Alira, still trembling with the last of her spent adrenaline, produced the crumpled letter from her bodice and set it on the table between them like evidence at a trial. Ronan read it twice, his expression darkening with every line, and by the time he set it down, the granite stillness Ren had first met in the chapel had returned in full, though this time she understood it for what it truly was: not coldness, but a man holding himself together by sheer discipline in the face of betrayal. "Your father knew," he said quietly. "Not suspected. Knew, with enough certainty to draft a marriage contract designed to place someone of his bloodline inside these walls specifically, at the exact moment my own wards were weakest." "I didn't know any of this until an hour ago," Alira said. "I swear it. If I had known what this marriage truly was, I would never have let Ren walk into it in my place." "I believe you," Ronan said. And he did. There had been no artifice in the desperate way she'd burst through that door, no calculation in the raw fear on her face. "But belief doesn't undo the fact that your father orchestrated a ritual capable of unleashing something that has killed men far stronger than either of us, and he did it using his own daughters as the instrument, whether or not either of you understood the shape of the trap." "What happens now?" Ren asked quietly, still bandaged, still bearing the exhausted, wired look of someone who had bled for a stranger's ancient magic less than an hour ago and somehow lived to ask the question. Ronan was silent for a long moment, turning the letter over in his hands as though it might yield more answers than it already had. "Now," he said finally, "I send word to your father that his scheme has failed, that his agent, whoever this was, willing to betray a debt and a secret both to warn you, has done more to protect this alliance than his own counsel ever intended it to survive. And I make it very clear that any further attempt to reach what sleeps beneath this mountain will be treated as the act of war it has always actually been, regardless of what treaty language he hides it inside." "And the marriage itself?" Alira asked carefully. "What happens to that?" It was here that Ronan's composure finally visibly cracked, his eyes moving not to Alira, who had asked the question, but to Ren, who had spent the entire night proving, action by reckless action, exactly the kind of woman she was. "That depends," he said slowly, "on what the woman who actually stood at that altar wishes to do with a marriage neither of us chose, but that may, against every reasonable expectation either of us carried into that chapel, have turned out to be worth keeping. Wren's breath caught. Alira glanced between the two of them, understanding dawning slowly on her exhausted face. "You're not asking to annul it," she said. "I am asking," Ronan said, holding Wren's gaze steadily, whether the woman who volunteered to face a stranger's rumored cruelty in her sister's place might consider staying to face whatever comes next in her own name, instead, not as a substitute, not as a disguise, but as herself. The room went very quiet. Somewhere beyond the walls, the last echoes of the creature's shriek had long since faded into ordinary mountain silence, and the fortress, for the first time in 3 years, felt merely like a fortress again, rather than a countdown toward some inevitable disaster. "I never asked to be a queen," Wren said finally, her voice quieter than Alira had heard it in years, stripped of its usual bravado. "I asked to protect my sister for one night. I didn't plan on any of this." "Neither did I," Ronan admitted. "I didn't plan on a wife who bled willingly for wards she didn't fully understand, for people she'd known less than a day, simply because someone she loved might be in danger. I have been alone in this fortress for 3 years, believing that was simply the price of what I carry in my blood. I find I am no longer entirely certain that has to remain true." Alira, watching her sister's face carefully in the firelight, saw something shift there, not the reckless bravery that had carried her through the night, but something steadier beneath it. Something that looked, for the first time, like a choice rather than a rescue. "Ask me again in the morning," Wren said finally, a ghost of her old defiant smile returning to her face. "When I've slept, and I'm not covered in my own blood, and I can be certain I'm answering because of who you actually are, and not simply because we survived something terrible together." "That," Ronan said, "something warm finally breaking through the granite for good, seems like exactly the kind of answer a woman like you should give." Morning came gray and quiet over Blackridge, the kind of pale, washed-out light that follows a night no one quite believes they survived, and Alira woke in a guest chamber to find her sister already awake, sitting by the window with her bandaged hand wrapped around a cup of untouched tea. "You look like someone who didn't sleep," Alira said, settling onto the edge of the bed. "I didn't," Wren admitted. "I kept thinking about what he asked me. And what have you decided?" Wren was quiet for a long moment, turning the cup slowly in her hands. "I've spent my whole life being the daughter no one quite knew what to do with," she said finally. "Too loud for court, too blunt for diplomacy, useful mostly for the things polite people were too careful to attempt themselves. Last night, I did something reckless, and it turned out to matter. It turned out to save someone. I'm not sure I've ever felt that before. That's not the same as loving him," Alira said gently. "No," Wren agreed. "But it might be the beginning of something that could become it, given time neither of us was given the chance to have honestly, without a lie standing between us." Before Alira could respond, a soft knock came at the door, and a servant informed them both that a rider had arrived from Aldenmere, at first light their father's own steward, sent ahead of a formal delegation, demanding an audience with the king regarding the status of the marriage contract. They found Ronan already in his war room when they arrived, standing over a map of the border territories with the exhausted, focused look of a man who had not slept either, flanked by his general and 2 advisors Wren didn't recognize. "Your father's steward is waiting in the outer hall," Ronan said without preamble as they entered. "He does not yet know what happened here last night. I intend to let him explain his own understanding of events before I reveal how much of it I already know." "A dangerous game," Alira said. "One I've played before," Ronan said grimly. "Bring him in." The steward who entered was smooth-faced and practiced, the kind of court official trained to smile through any storm. and he began at once with careful condolences about the disruption to the wedding celebrations, vague references to unfortunate rumors of unrest near the fortress, delicate inquiries about whether the alliance remained secure despite the disturbance. Ronan let him talk for nearly 2 full minutes before setting the crumpled warning letter flat on the table between them. "Tell your king," he said, his voice dropping into the same flat, terrifying calm Wren had first mistaken for cruelty, "that I know precisely what he intended when he insisted this wedding take place at Blackridge rather than on neutral ground. I know what sleeps beneath this mountain, and I know his council believed a woman of his bloodline standing close enough to these walls at the moment my wards weakened would be sufficient to wake it, whether or not she survived what came after." The steward's careful composure faltered for the first time. "Your Majesty, I'm certain there has been some both his daughters know now as well." Ronan continued, unmoved, which means whatever leverage he believed this scheme gave him has evaporated entirely, along with any claim he might make to future goodwill from this pack. "Tell him the wards have been resealed, that the wedding stands, and that any further attempt on this fortress or its foundations will be answered not as a domestic grievance between allied kingdoms, but as the act of war it has been from the very beginning." The steward, pale now, bowed stiffly and retreated without further argument, clearly recognizing a conversation that had already been decided long before he'd entered the room. Once the door closed behind him, Ronan turned to the sisters, some of the cold authority draining from his face, replaced by something more tired, more human. "He will deny everything, of course," he said. "Kings always do, when caught. But he will not risk another attempt, not now that the wards are whole again and his own daughters stand as witnesses to what he tried to do." "And if he retaliates against us," Alira asked, "for exposing him?" "Then he retaliates against a fortress with a king who owes your family a debt he intends to repay in full," Ronan said, glancing toward Wren as he said it, "and a border alliance that, whatever its origins, appears to have survived its first true test rather better than anyone expected it to." Wren met his eyes across the war room, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with wards or bloodlines or ancient magic sleeping beneath a mountain, and everything to do with 2 people who had chosen, in the space of a single terrifying night, to trust each other with the truth when it would have been far easier to keep hiding behind a veil. The days that followed passed in the strange suspended quiet that comes after a crisis survived but not yet fully understood. Alira stayed on at Blackridge rather than returning to Aldenmere immediately, unwilling to leave her sister among strangers so soon after everything they'd both been through, and Ronan, to his credit, never once made her feel unwelcome for it. She watched them from a careful distance during that week, watched her sister and the king she'd married under a false name circle each other, with the wary curiosity of 2 people who had survived something together before they'd ever properly courted, learning each other backward. Truth before flirtation, danger before comfort. It should have been strange. Instead, it seemed, somehow, to suit them both. "I keep waiting for him to be cruel," Alira admitted one evening, sitting with Wren on a stone balcony overlooking the mountains that had so recently held something monstrous at bay. The rumors were so specific. 2 wives, one vanished, one silenced. He explained that too, Wren said. Once we'd had a few days to actually speak like people, rather than strangers negotiating a crisis. His first wife left because she recognized, faster than he did, that the wards were failing, and that staying close to him put her at risk of being exactly what your father's scheme nearly used me for. She begged him to let her go before anyone else could use her the way my father tried to use me. He agreed because he loved her enough to lose her rather than endanger her. And the second? She swore an oath of silence to protect her own family from a conflict brewing along a different border entirely, something unrelated to Blackridge altogether. He let the rumors about her stand rather than break her confidence and expose the real reason, even though it cost him every ounce of his own reputation to do it. Alira was quiet for a moment, watching the last light fade over the mountains. "He let himself be called a monster twice," she said slowly, rather than tell the truth and put two women he cared about at greater risk. "That's the man I married by accident," Ren said, a small, private smile tugging at her mouth. Turns out the rumors were never about cruelty at all. They were about a man who kept choosing other people's safety over his own reputation, over and over, until there was no one left who knew the real story except him. Below them, in the courtyard, Ronan appeared, glancing up toward the balcony with the particular attentiveness of a man who had learned, over one impossible night, exactly which windows his wife favored. "Go on," Alira said, nudging her sister's shoulder gently. "I believe you have an answer to give him, and I think we both know you decided it days ago." Ren rose, smoothing the front of a gown that was entirely her own now, worn without any veil to hide behind, and made her way down through the fortress toward the courtyard, where Ronan waited beneath the darkening sky. Patient in a way Alira suspected he had never quite managed to be with anyone before her. Alira watched from the balcony as her sister crossed the courtyard, watched Ronan's entire posture shift the moment he saw her coming, not the careful stillness of a king performing composure for an audience, but the unguarded attention of a man who had genuinely stopped expecting anyone to choose to stay. She couldn't hear what was said between them. She didn't need to. She could see it in the way Ren finally reached for his hand without hesitation, in the way his shoulders dropped, in the way for the first time since Alira had known him, Alpha King Ronan of Blackridge looked less like a fortress and more like a man who had just been given something he'd stopped believing he deserved. That night, for the first time in 3 days, no bells rang in warning, no shadows circled the outer walls, and the mountain slept as quietly as it had in the years before any of this had begun, not because the danger was entirely gone, Alira suspected. Ancient magic rarely surrendered so completely, but because two people who had started as a lie standing in for someone else had somehow, through fire and blood and one impossibly long night, found their way to something entirely their own. She left for Aldenmere 3 days later with an armed escort Ronan insisted on providing, and with a letter for their father that she suspected would end considerably more relationships than it repaired. But she left knowing her sister was not merely safe, but chosen properly, finally, as herself, in a fortress that had stopped being a countdown and started, slowly, to become a home. The wedding that followed, 6 weeks later, bore almost no resemblance to the first one. There was no veil this time. Ren had insisted on that above everything else, standing in the same chapel where she had once hidden her face out of necessity, this time with her chin lifted and her dark hair loose and unbraided, exactly as unpolished and exactly as herself as she had ever been in her life. Alira stood as her sister's only attendant, watching from the front row with a lump in her throat she hadn't expected, remembering the terrified girl who had pinned silver combs into her own hair 6 weeks earlier, certain she was walking toward a monster, never imagining the story would end here instead, with her sister radiant and unafraid, marrying the same man for entirely different reasons than the ones written into that original contract. "Do you, Alpha King Ronan of the Blackridge Pack, take this woman as your mate and queen?" the priest intoned, and this time Ronan didn't wait for the formal cue. "I do," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the second word, something Ren would tease him about for years afterward, something that made the whole chapel break into warm, startled laughter. "Do you, Ren of Aldenmere, take this man as your mate and king?" the priest continued, and Ren, unable to help herself, glanced sideways at Alira with a grin so wide it barely fit her face before turning back to Ronan. "I do," she said, "and I mean it this time. Properly, as myself. The kingdom took the news of the marriage's true circumstances with more grace than Elira had expected. Once the formal accounts were quietly amended, and the truth, carefully managed, was allowed to spread not the full truth of ancient wards and things sleeping beneath mountains, which remained a secret held among only a handful of people, but the truth of a princess who had loved her sister enough to risk everything for one night, and a sister who had loved her back enough to find, unexpectedly, a life worth keeping in the deception. Elira's father sent no formal apology, and none was ever expected. Word had reached Aldenmere quickly enough of what his council had attempted, and the political fallout had been severe enough on its own allies quietly withdrawing support. Whispers of the scandal reaching courts far beyond the valley that Ronan considered the matter, in his own words, sufficiently and permanently settled, without further need for confrontation. He had made his position clear once, in that war room, and he saw no reason to repeat himself for a man who had already lost far more than he could ever hope to regain. What mattered more to Elira, in the months that followed, was watching her sister become something neither of them had ever imagined possible, not the difficult daughter, not the reckless substitute, not the girl too loud for polite rooms, but a queen who ruled Blackridge with exactly the fierce, unfiltered honesty that had once made her impossible to marry off, and who found, to everyone's quiet surprise including her own, that a fortress full of hardened soldiers and wary advisors responded rather well to a leader who said precisely what she meant, and meant precisely what she said. Ronan changed too, though more slowly, more quietly, the granite stillness softening by degrees into something that still commanded a room, but no longer needed to hide behind silence to do it. Elira watched him laugh, actually laugh, at a joke of Wren's during a winter feast months later, and thought of the man she'd first glimpsed through a torn veil in a chapel doorway, and marveled at how completely a person could be misjudged by rumors built entirely on his own self-sacrifice. She stayed at Blackridge through that first winter, in no hurry to return to a father's court she no longer entirely trusted, and found herself, in quiet, unguarded moments, wondering what her own future might hold now that it was no longer written into a contract she'd had no say in. There was time enough for that question. For now it was enough to watch her sister become a queen not through the accident of a switched veil, but through the deliberate daily choice to stay somewhere she had once only meant to visit for a single dangerous night. The old ward stones held steady through that winter and the next, tended now by 2 people instead of 1. The ancient burden shared in a way it had never been shared before, and whatever slept beneath Blackridge Mountain slept quietly on, undisturbed by any further scheme, guarded by a fortress that had finally, after 3 long years, stopped feeling like a countdown and started, slowly and completely, to feel like exactly what it had always been meant to be. A home. Chosen, this time, by everyone who lived inside it. 2 years later, Elira stood on that same balcony where she had once watched her sister cross a courtyard toward a decision that would change both their lives, and looked down now at something entirely different. Wren, seated on the flagstones in a gown far too fine for sitting on flagstones, laughing as a small, dark-haired girl with her mother's stubborn chin and her father's unsettling gold eyes toddled unsteadily across the courtyard toward a very patient, very still wolf who could only be Ronan in his shifted form, tail wagging low and careful, letting his daughter grab fistfuls of his fur without so much as a flinch. It still startled Elira sometimes, how ordinary it had all become, how a fortress once wrapped in rumors of monsters and vanished wives now rang, most evenings, with a child's delighted shrieking and her mother's answering laughter. She descended to join them, and Wren looked up with the easy, unguarded smile she'd worn more and more often these past 2 years, the smile of a woman who had stopped waiting for the other terrible thing to happen and had simply allowed herself, finally, to be happy. "You're just in time," Ren said, as Alira settled onto the flagstones beside her. She's about to attempt to ride him like a very small, very determined knight. Ronan huffed something that might have been a wolf's version of a long-suffering sigh, and lowered himself patiently as his daughter, undeterred by dignity or physics, attempted exactly that. Alira laughed and reached out to steady the little girl before she tipped sideways off her father's back entirely, and thought, not for the first time, how strange and how right it was that the story of a switched veil and a stolen wedding night had ended not in tragedy, as every rumor had once insisted it must, but in this an ordinary evening full of ordinary joy, hard-won and entirely undeserved by the standards of the fear that had once ruled all their lives. "Any word from home?" Ren asked. Once their daughter had abandoned the wolf in favor of chasing a moth across the courtyard, Ronan, shifting back into his own shape and reaching for a robe a servant had long ago learned to leave nearby for exactly this purpose. "Some," Alira said. "Father's health is failing. The council grows louder about who should inherit in his place. I'm told there are already 3 different factions arguing over my future the way they once argued over yours." "And what do you want to do about that?" Ronan asked, settling onto the flagstones beside his wife with the unhurried ease of a man who had long since stopped needing to perform kingliness for anyone in his own courtyard. Alira considered the question longer than she expected to. She thought of the girl who had once stood shaking before a mirror, certain her only value lay in the alliance her marriage could secure. She thought of everything that had happened since the letter, the pass through the mountains at night, the culvert and the torn skirts, and the terror of a bell tolling somewhere she couldn't yet reach in time. "I want to choose it myself," she said finally, "whatever it ends up being. I spent 19 years having my future decided in rooms I wasn't allowed into. I find I'm no longer willing to let that happen again, whatever it costs the factions arguing about it." Ren reached over and squeezed her sister's hand, the old fierce protectiveness still there beneath the settled contentment of motherhood and marriage. The same protectiveness that had once sent her walking into a stranger's chambers wearing someone else's face. "Then, you'll choose it," Ren said simply. "And whatever you choose, you won't be doing it alone. Not this time. Not ever again, if I have anything to say about it." Their daughter came tumbling back into the circle of lamplight just then, moth forgotten, demanding to be lifted onto her mother's lap, and the conversation dissolved the way important conversations often do around small children, into softer things, simpler things, the particular ordinary magic of an evening with nowhere else it needed to be. Later, once the little girl had been carried off to bed by a doting nursemaid, and the courtyard had gone quiet under a wide, undramatic moon, Alira lingered a while longer on the flagstones, watching her sister lean into her husband's side with the easy familiarity of 2 years and a lifetime still ahead of them. She thought about rumors and how completely they could distort a person into something they'd never truly been. She thought about veils, literal and otherwise, and how much courage it sometimes took to remove one, and how much more courage it took, afterward, to be seen exactly as you were, and stay anyway. She thought about her father's schemes, and the ancient thing still sleeping quietly beneath the mountain, tended now by 2 people who had learned to share a burden instead of carrying it alone, and about how the things that seemed most likely to destroy a person sometimes became, against every reasonable expectation, the very thing that finally taught them how to be loved. The switch had been meant to last one night. A single veil, a single deception, a single desperate act of protection between 2 sisters who had never imagined it would become anything more than a brief and frightening detour before their real lives resumed. Instead, it had become the beginning of an entirely different life altogether, one neither sister had planned for, one built on truth uncovered rather than lies maintained, one that had turned a fortress full of rumors into a home full of laughter, a marriage of convenience into a marriage of choice, and a king once mistaken for a monster into simply, finally, a man who had been loved enough to stop hiding, and had loved enough in return to let himself be found. And if the mountains still dreamed beneath them, old and patient and waiting, it dreamed now over a household that had already survived its worst secret and come out the other side, not broken, but entirely, unexpectedly whole. Sometimes, on quiet nights when sleep didn't come easily, Alira found herself thinking back to that first terrified evening before the mirror, the maids pinning silver combs into her hair, the certainty in her chest that she was dressing herself for a funeral disguised as a wedding. She had been so sure then that fear was the only honest response to a life decided entirely by other people's ambitions. She had not yet learned that sometimes the very thing you dread most is simply waiting to be understood correctly, that monsters in rumors are so often just wounded men mistaken for cruelty because the truth would have cost someone else too much. She thought too of her sister's recklessness, the trait their father had once called unmarriageable, and how that same recklessness had turned out to be exactly what this fortress needed most: someone brave enough to walk into danger without waiting for permission. Perhaps that was the truest lesson of it all, Alira thought, watching the moon climb higher over the mountain that had once terrified her and now merely watched over her like an old familiar friend. That courage doesn't always look like standing your ground. Sometimes it looks like offering to stand in someone else's, and sometimes it looks like removing a veil you have every reason to keep in place. That love, real love, is so rarely the dramatic rescue the old tales promise, and so much more often the quiet, daily choice to stay once the danger has passed and only the person remains. She rose at last from the flagstones and made her way inside, past the sleeping fortress, past the nursery where her niece dreamed untroubled dreams, past the war room where a marriage born of manipulation had somehow become a genuine partnership between equals. She paused at the threshold of her own chamber, looking back down the corridor toward the wing, where her sister slept beside the king she had married under a false name and stayed with under her true one, and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't expected to feel this soon. Hope, not the desperate, fragile hope she had carried into that chapel 2 years ago, praying a veil would be enough to protect someone she loved. Something steadier than that, something closer to faith, not in fate, not in destiny, not in ancient magic sleeping beneath old mountains, but in people, in the particular, unglamorous courage it took to tell the truth once the lie had already served its purpose, and to keep choosing each other afterward, day after ordinary day, long after the danger that first brought them together had faded into nothing more than a story, told to a laughing child chasing moths across a quiet courtyard. Whatever waited for her in Aldenmere, whatever choice she was finally free to make about her own future, she carried that lesson with her now like a second inheritance, more valuable than any crown. The bravest thing a person could do was rarely to hide behind someone else's face. It was to remove the veil, stand in the firelight exactly as yourself, and trust the truth was worth more than any comfortable lie in its place. And somewhere behind her, in a fortress that had finally stopped being a countdown, the mountain slept on, patient and quiet, guarding nothing more dangerous now than a family who had chosen, against every rumor and every scheme, to stay.